So give it up for Andy Domeyer.
All right. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Good. Those who said no, I didn't want you to hear me anyway. All right. Thanks for having me tonight. Real quick, I just wanted to get another kind of scan of the crowd on a few things here. How many folks here have an SRE title in their org today? Raise your hand. So that is perfect. Okay, that's like less than 10%. I was having a lot of fun putting this deck together, but one of the things that I was really struggling with is similar to like what DevOps was 4, 5, 6 years ago. A room this full is going to vary drastically in terms of everybody's experience and understanding of maybe what the topic is or potentially how you're doing it within your org. And so one of the things that I want to encourage here is I'm having fun with this tonight. I think it's going to be educational. I'm really hoping that there's going to be a few nuggets that everybody can take back and apply or something valuable, but I recognize that some of these things are going to stay really high level, and there's free beer. And so let's chat about it afterwards. If you want to go deeper on any particular topic, I'm really interested in doing that, but I just really was trying to manage kind of how deep to go on things. So, all right, let's jump into it. So the road to reliability. First, let's level set on the definition of reliability. The quality of being trustworthy or of performing consistently well. That seems to check out pretty reasonably right. I think when I was going to Google to get the simplest and shortest definition of that, one of the most interesting aspects I found was that we're a little late to the party when you look at the use of reliability over time. In 1980, we already started trending down. So I decided to change the rest of my talk to be about Kubernetes and serverless. So we're going to go into that the rest of the way because reliability is no longer interesting. Obviously, I'm kidding. All right, so what does it mean to be reliable in tech? I think there's some pretty basic things that go into that. High availability. Hopefully, you're consistently performant. It's a site that doesn't work great one day and not the next. You regularly get new features and functions that actually work, not something flaky. And we all recognize, especially in tech, we probably have empathy for other SaaS services we're using. If it doesn't work that great, hopefully it works better sometime soon, and there's some fast fixes. What this talk isn't is this talk isn't what is SRE. And I want to be really specific about that. This is more about what are some things that you would want to do within your org or take back to your org to bring more SRE principles in. And so there's a really awesome big book. There's a Google workbook that goes into this. Some principles I think are fair to level set on. It's just one of the most important things is that operations can be a software problem. And that's something for a lot of organizations that's really hard to turn a corner on and to understand how we start thinking about some of these systems that we produce in operations like infrastructure as a service, as opposed to something that is this old operational thing that just needs to be managed differently. Other principles that come out of that book at a high level, things are going to break. Don't promise 100%, but think about how to build better contracts around that. Minimize your toil, reduce the cost of failure, make it safe to fail. That's one of the things that really emboldens an organization and helps an organization to move quicker, feel more safe to make change, really help with your velocity. Share ownership between dev and ops in terms of what it means to be reliable for the different services. And also use the same tooling, and this is one I'll hit on a bit later, but I think this one, I'm really partial to this in my experience here at SPS. I've seen this really play out where, yeah, the tool maybe doesn't cover every single use case, and there's one specific edge case that something else could be better at. But when you use the same tools, you speak the same language, and that really matters at the end of the day. It goes a long way. So Bridget already gave my spoiler alert, which is this isn't easy, and this doesn't happen overnight. And you don't go back to an organization tomorrow and say, we should do SRE, and it's just going to fix everything. We're going to get so much more reliabilities. It's going to be awesome. It doesn't work that way. So what I'm going to try to do in this talk is talk a little bit about things that I think are important for everyone in this room to be mindful of, regardless of where you are in your SRE journey, and then talk a little bit about things that we've done at SPS that I think have been really interesting, but that also maybe share some ideas on things that might be applicable to you, because everybody in this room is in a different situation. You might be a system engineer only doing Linux system administration. You might actually be helping do things with deployment automation. You might be doing something more full stack. You might be a product engineer. So everybody's coming at this from a different angle, and I'm going to do my best to try to just hit on those things, and we'll chat more later if there's areas you want to go deeper in. So that being said, there's a few things that I think are really important as you think about how you might want to try to apply this or foster some of these some of this direction in your organization to be mindful of, with regards to the circumstances of your org. The first is your culture, and we say culture a lot. It's been used a ton in the DevOps movement, but one of the things that I want to really hit home here is this is about how, not can, how your organization can successfully move towards SRE is going to be highly dependent on your company culture. So that means your company culture doesn't mean you can't. It's just going to change the way that you potentially have to approach this problem and think about how you build trust and empathy in a way that allows you and your organization to share things, make commitments to each other that matter, and build trust and a level of accountability that you're going to deliver things for people that are going to make them better and vice versa, and meet those expectations. And that is really fundamental to DevOps too. That is something you'll see a lot when you read up on SRE, is there's a lot of foundational things that came from the DevOps movement that really are embodied by the SRE role. The other is the org chart. And this gets talked about a bit in tech conferences, but not a ton. And the thing here, again, is not can, but how your organization can successfully move towards SRE is going to be highly dependent on your current org structure and company size. So the larger the organization, the bigger the ship, the harder it is to churn generally. So you have to manage some of your expectations around those things. But oftentimes what comes into play here a bit more is that org is used to create ownership boundaries a lot of times, right? And that's going to be foundational to what are the things that you need to improve. Do you need to improve your monitoring? Well, who owns your monitoring? Does everybody own their own monitoring stack? Do you own one that's better than somebody else's? How do you collaborate on those things? How do you build a sense of trust? Or more importantly, how do you get everybody in your organization to recognize your intent is to just drive improvement? Your intent doesn't necessarily need to be, I'm trying to own the deployment stack, or I'm trying to own the monitoring stack. Your intent is just to try to drive improvement. But depending on your organizational boundaries, that can take time to build that trust, to make sure people understand what the intent is, to build some alignment and agreement on direction. And your ideas might not be the right ones either, right? So you need feedback to figure out how to do that. And these organizational boundaries, I think a lot of times, they're not silos. They can be looked at as that, but that's not necessarily the case. If you have a culture of trust and accountability, and you recognize the fact that you need somebody to create really effective deployment automation because it makes everybody in your organization that much better, that's a service that needs to be delivered. That's important, that everybody should care about, but somebody needs to be accountable for delivering that. And that's different than a silo. It becomes a silo if that organization chooses not to listen to feedback or be held accountable for any metrics that matter. But that, again, is a cultural thing, not necessarily something that is negative because of the boundaries that were created. So, does that make sense? Anyone completely disagree with that? If you don't, I don't agree with you anyway. I'm just kidding. And the last part, circumstances to be aware of, is tooling. So you have tools that exist today. They're not necessarily all great, but likely a lot of folks in your organization know them really well. And being able to reuse that can set you up for success. There are a ridiculous amount of tools out there. It's likely that a variety of the company or of the teams in your organization have strong preferences or opinions on what these are. And we all agree that if we just move to the cloud, we don't have to use any of them and everything's great, right? Done. Just write a bigger operational expense check and things are great. But seriously, tooling does matter, and stopping to recognize what tools exist. Where is there duplication? Where is there alignment? And then where is there some momentum and where isn't there? Those are circumstances that are going to be really helpful to recognize when you think about how you might try to move your organization more towards SRE. When we're talking about SRE or even DevOps in general, it's easy to be really, really broad, right? Like there's a ton of things that you could talk about, and you could decide tomorrow that building empathy across your operations and dev teams is the most important thing in the world. And then 2 days later, you're going to have an incident, and then you're going to realize, well, gosh, if we would have just monitored our website, we would have known it was down. Maybe monitoring is the most important thing that we have to do. And so stopping and doing a good job of internalizing what's really important for your organization is really helpful. But I think to do that, sometimes it's helpful for us to let's just go a layer deeper and agree on what some of the problem spaces are when we're talking about SRE. This is where I had a little fun. I called an artist friend of mine who you would think is my 5-year-old, but sadly it's me. So let's break down the problem space. A couple things I want to keep in mind with this fun little storytelling thing I worked out here is every business is unique. It's important for us to focus on the business problem before we focus on solutions. Kubernetes is exciting. Serverless is exciting. Deployment automation is exciting. But what's some of the business problems that are out there? And do we have alignment as an organization on what these problem spaces are? You might have a lot of different problem spaces to tackle, but if as an org, there's one specific one that makes sense to drill into, spend your time on that. So walking through kind of a general life cycle of deployment here, we have a developer here. She writes some ridiculously awesome new feature. That code is great. So obviously it gets merged right away into GitHub. It passes all its tests. So jazz hands, it turns into a container in some exciting automated way. And now that that container exists, it obviously gets deployed by some chatbot or some ship-it parent to your production Kubernetes cluster, right? And now you have a bunch of customers on the backside saying, oh my gosh, this feature is great. Please take more of my money. Something that Istana probably says daily. And then you've got that one customer, of course, that doesn't even need your service, but says, oh my gosh, they're running containers in production on Kubernetes. I'm totally going to use their stack. This is so cool. And of course, like everybody else in here, you have an operations engineer who gets to sleep through the night because everything works great, right? That's what everyone's deployment and production system looks like today in here, maybe?
Absolutely.
We have 1.5 hands raised. One of them, I think, was just stretching. So I think we can agree that this isn't, I mean, in principle, there are some things here that make a lot of sense. But in terms of how it is applied and what we're trying to do at every organization varies drastically, right? But we can agree on a couple things. There's a build and deploy component to building software and getting it in your customers' hands in a way that's valuable. That matters, and matters very regularly. There's a production infrastructure component that always exists and matters very regularly, right? Whether it's Kubernetes, whether you're running on VMware in a physical data center, whether you're running on EC2 instances or in Azure or wherever you're running, there's infrastructure that's happening. And if you're serverless, that's still an infrastructure service. I'll get into that with you later. And you likely have some sort of monitoring that woke up the operations engineer at some point along the way. So these things are all out there. What the question that I have for everybody else here is, and Joe, I know you love trivia, but I don't know if you're going to jump on this one, is when we talk about things like build and deploy, when we talk about things like infrastructure services, and when we talk about things like monitoring and observability, what's something they all have in common? Anyone want to throw some guesses out there? There's more than one answer, but the one I have on the slide next is the right one. People, software, automation, not reliable. They're broken.
Money, they cost
Unknowns, they cost money. All of these things are really true. One of the things that I for me has been really changing, really impactful to the way that I think about these problems is that regardless of how you're doing them, those things always exist. I don't care if you're copy pasting, that's deployment. If you have a desk under your server or a server under your desk, not a desk under your server, that would be, probably a lot of people have desks under their server to think about it. That is still infrastructure that's running your systems. If your customers call you because your site's down and you don't have any other way to tell that, that's still a way for you to monitor your systems. It's a really, really terrible way to do it, but it is a form of monitoring. And if you look at your hold queues and queue depths for customers on hold, that's kind of like observability.
And if you have all of those at the same time?
That's DevOps. If you have all of those at the same time, that's DevOps. Does anybody disagree with this statement? That deployment, infrastructure services, and monitoring and observability always exist if you're running a technology stack? They always have to, right? We all agree on that. So we have some foundation now that we can start having some more specific discussions about. But so what? Right? It's easy for us to go back to our organizations or to our teams and say, gosh, you know what? We have deployments. Yep. Yeah, we got a lot of deployments. We got some infrastructure too. Yep. Yeah, we got some servers. Some are here, some are in the cloud, somewhere. But so what? What does that mean? Has anyone here ever heard the term undifferentiated engineering? Nobody. Bridget has. A couple people have. Amy, you have, because I say it a lot at you, I think, when I'm venting. All right. Undifferentiated engineering. This is a really, really, I think, fundamental and not often talked about term that we need to be talking more about in this space. And at the end of the day, this is just engineering effort that must occur to some degree. Regardless of your org structure, regardless of what you're doing, you have to deploy your code for it to be used. You have to have infrastructure for your code to run on. You have to be able to monitor your code. For a separate talk, your code should be secure too. None of those things, set your product apart from somebody else's in terms of the fact that it has to be done. Your competitors have to do the same thing. The fact that you're doing them doesn't differentiate your product from anyone else's. There's nothing about the fact that you're doing these things that changes between people other than maybe how you do it or how efficient you are at doing it. But what's really important to recognize when you think about especially how large your organization is that undifferentiated engineering efforts are often the most valuable solutions to share within an organization. Everybody, every product team in your organization needs to deploy their code. Every single one of them. Every single product team in your organization needs infrastructure to run on. Every single product team in your organization has to know if their services are up and running or how they're performing, that monitoring observability layer. They all have to do those things. So don't isolate some of those learnings where you don't need to. Certainly do that where it's effective, but don't necessarily isolate it where you don't need to. And at the end of the day, when you start thinking about some of those things, organizations that are highly effective at undifferentiated engineering efforts have a competitive advantage. Look at the Netflix or the different unicorns of this space today. They really stand out because guess what? They can deploy 50 times a day without friction. They have really cost-effective, scalable infrastructure. They know immediately when something's wrong. The cost for something being broken is really low because they can respond to it and identify it really quickly. So, who's excited to do undifferentiated engineering? Right? How exciting does that sound? I maybe word arted my son's shirt a little bit here. He was much more excited about being a big brother than that. But as uninteresting as undifferentiated engineering sounds, those are things like Kubernetes or Prometheus or doing service discovery or moving to the cloud or using service meshes or automating your deployment and building in test automation to the deployment or putting new security within your deployment pipeline. Those are the types of things that are undifferentiated engineering works of effort that everybody needs to do, and the more effectively you can do them, the more of a competitive advantage you have within your industry. So, I just talked a whole bunch, maybe with more energy than I should, on a couple of these topics, but let's just check in and revisit a few things. We're recognizing now that each company has its own culture, its own org structure, its own tools that create unique circumstances for things you have to be mindful about, and those are all going to vary based on everyone's situation here, and that's going to change how you try to drive improvement or change within your organization. Additionally, we acknowledge that deployment services, infrastructure services, modern observability are all undifferentiated engineering efforts that exist in some form in every organization. Fair? Mostly fair? All right. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk is just go a little bit deeper into ways that now that we recognize these different problem spaces, how we might identify and take action on some of these undifferentiated opportunities. Undifferentiated is a lot of syllables to keep saying over and over again. But what I'll do is just try to give some framework. I think everyone and every situation is going to be a little bit different, so certainly modify these to what makes sense for your situation. But give a little framework on how you might approach these. I'll share some of what we're doing at SPS, and then share some ideas that maybe are nuggets you can take back to your situation. So firstly, organizing your approach. Remember the kind of the first slides that we went through and kind of the foundation that we put together here, and build on that. So stop and think about really clearly defining the problem space and build consensus. So the way we just all talked about the fact that deployment always exists. Does your organization see it that way? Do they recognize it that way? Do they see it as a problem? Monitoring, infrastructure, those types of things. But then define who owns it. In a lot of organizations, a lot of different people own deployment, and that's fine. In a lot of organizations, usually just one or two teams own infrastructure. That's fine too. In some organizations, everybody owns monitoring. In some organizations, nobody owns monitoring. But be explicit about who owns that or who could own it if there isn't an owner today. But then define the customers for that problem space as a next step. So for example, at SPS, a lot of what we're trying to do with our SRE team specifically is to try to own the deployment and the compute. So if we're going to build a Kubernetes platform, we want to help people deploy to it easily. So that means in those scenarios, a lot of our customers are going to be our delivery teams or our development teams. And so that's an example of how we might define those two situations. The next step in this is identifying metrics that help measure the problem space. So are you trying to improve monitoring? Are you trying to improve infrastructure? What are the metrics that actually tell you how good you're doing today? And then what are the metrics that will actually demonstrate if you're driving improvement on those things? So if you're monitoring, if you're thinking that you can drive improvement in monitoring, I would assume that over time your incident rates might go down. How do you start to think about collecting those metrics now so that you can make a difference later? More importantly though, you got to stop and review those metrics with your customers. Do they agree that those metrics are valuable? Just because you count the number of deployments doesn't necessarily mean you've made deployments easier. It just means that you're counting them. So what are some things that maybe your customer can get behind to better understand what that means? And then also understand the level of effort to improve. You shouldn't try to do everything at once, but what are the right things for your organization at which time? Or maybe what is the path of least resistance for now? Maybe it's something that lands in your team's ownership as opposed to somebody else's that you might have opinions about. So we'll just go through each of the different problem spaces we talked about earlier and kind of talk about what maybe some things we've done at SPS that I think are interesting, and then I'll share some ideas. So for the first problem space in build and deploy, I think areas in build and deploy that are interesting to consider, different for everybody, but version control, build servers, kind of provisioning and reusable patterns and testing frameworks, as well as change management. At SPS, the SRE team primarily owns a lot of the space. CloudOps has some parts in it as well. And our primary customers are our development teams. I think that there's some really interesting performance metrics. Most of them have to do with the average time to complete a deploy. I'll be transparent. Some challenges we have at SPS is nobody wants to punch a clock when they're trying to do a deploy. And like that's annoying. So what makes a lot more sense is just to have some conversations with some of your engineers and say, is this going well, is this not? If this takes too much time, what parts of it do? So in that scenario, it's maybe less formal feedback than something you can put on a chart and graph. But we have a great culture in terms of trust and accountability where we can build on those conversations and take action on them. Something that we've recently done is diving into our delivery team, our development team's customer feedback. And one of the things we're reflecting on is that they really want a better option for automating blue-green deployments. So in our infrastructure today, we've got a really nice deployment model, but one of the things it doesn't really allow for is traffic shaping or traffic weighting in a way that if somebody deploys a new web service, we can really effectively manage 10% of the traffic, watch error rates, and then slowly shuffle more on. It's kind of the load balancer points at the new containers or not. And so understanding that level of effort and balancing against it, some things that make a lot of sense for us that we're working on that I'm happy to chat about later is that it makes sense for us to really rethink what kind of edge proxy layers and traffic routing we have at SPS and thinking more about service discovery in a way that lets us do traffic routing with some of the newer proxy technologies like Traffic or Envoy, HA Proxy, Nginx are all out there. But the idea of having more agility in routing traffic coming into our network is something that gives us a lot more flexibility to automate down the road. You want this version of these containers that are labeled to get 10% of the traffic for 2 hours before we increase that, things like that. So that's an example of this problem space at SPS. I think other areas that maybe might resonate to some situations that some folks in the crowd are in. A lot of companies aren't consistent with their version control tooling and or their process. This is really fundamental to collaborating. What happens if everybody has a different process or a different flow for how you approach or find different tech in your stack? That's a pretty approachable thing to think about getting after in the build deploy space. Standard build server patterns. This is an area that having something standard to start from sometimes benefits a lot of folks, even though there's a lot of customization that could happen after. Friction within your change management process is an interesting one. Some things we've done at SPS that I think are interesting there is trying to use and recognize what our change success rates are over time to help infer confidence. Like if your change success rate, Andy, is really terrible, because I know you personally, so I can pick on you, I'm not going to trust your next change to go well, right? But Nate's behind you. I mean, I'm just going to go to sleep. His are fine. He gets auto-approved all the time.
Don't let a manager quote.
Thinking about in this space for build deploy, depending on how your team is set up, does it make sense to centralize the ownership of tools that everybody shares? This is in all of these where I'm talking about how things might apply to you. I try to do general caution and advice thing. That is a bit contradictory to the caution part here. So I would say more than any other space that we talked about today, there tends to be many, many super strong opinions in this space for build deploy. And so it's really important, I think, if you're going to try to move the needle in your organization here, to spend time collaborating and really building empathy and building an understanding of your customers' use cases, because this is not one where you come in tomorrow and say, this new drone server is going to change the world and you should spend half of your next sprint changing how you deploy things. That's just not going to go over well. And a lot of people are really connected to the hard work they did to get where they were. So this is a really important thing to be mindful of. Advice here, though, I think is it's really important, and this could apply to all of them, but I think more importantly in build deploy, lead and be transparent with your intent. And if your intent is to improve something, whether it's the build and deploy or anything else, say it, right? A lot of times in technology, it's easy for us to jump into the tech, right? But if you start the conversation with, hey, Andy, gosh, you know what? Your change rates just aren't the best. But I just want to really talk about the fact that I think I have some ideas that can help make those rates better, and I think they could be really reusable, and I'd love to team up on those. If you start the conversation there, that sure changes the tone of the meeting the rest of the way, doesn't it? Or even at least just being transparent with what it is. And it might not be one meeting where you change somebody's opinion or mind, but starting there really matters. Next, for infrastructure services. So this one's kind of crazy, right? Like this could be, depending on where you are, it could be VMs, you could be in the cloud, you could be on bare metal. It could be platforms like Kube or Mesos or anything else. Network infrastructure could fall in here, databases, storage. This one's pretty intense, and it's very circumstantial. So at SPS, there's a lot of different owners of this area. SRE owns platforms. Cloud operations team owns a lot of our cloud stuff. Database engineering owns a lot of the databases. System engineering owns a lot of the VMs and bare metal and load balancers and all sorts of other crazy stuff. At the end of the day, our primary customers here still are delivery teams internally. And just recognizing things like different alert frequencies or availability, vulnerability, how cost effective these systems are different metrics that make sense for like how are we doing in terms of performance around these systems. One of the things that has come up mainly from leadership, but I think in general as an org we think this is a healthy thing, is that it would sure be nice to have a lot cheaper compute. If we could have that ready and then also available to scale when our apps need to scale, that would be super. That was something that our team did a great job on last year, and they built a really effective platform using AWS ECS in this case out on spot instances. So we have really cheap compute, and we can manage and keep a buffer of overhead so containers could scale up and down without having too much friction and having to wait for servers to boot up and that 10 to 20 minute warm-up time on some of those EC2 instances. But that was a really big one for us last year, and really helped us get more cost effective and also allow for kind of better boot up time. In terms of other situations that might apply to you, maybe you're not running containers or platforms at all yet. Maybe it's time to start that conversation. Again, this might be a conversation that's really important to lead with intent. Are you trying to be more agile with the infrastructure? Are you trying to be more cost effective? Consistent and automated infrastructure patterns. How many people here in the last 3 months have built servers that are more than just one OS type? Like, are you running Ubuntu and CentOS and Windows and whatever else? And like, there's business reasons to do that, but there's certainly a lot of opportunity to improve in some scenarios if you get more consistent. Obviously, improving on cost is a huge one that's going to get leadership's attention. improving time to provision if you need to help try to figure out how to get more agile or move quicker, and decreasing your vulnerabilities if you're in a highly secure environment. Obviously, that's a super important one. Some caution here. This one's, I can say I'm certainly guilty of it too. I get drawn to new tech really quick, really easily. So you have to be really careful not to introduce a whole bunch of new tech all at once, especially if it's critical production systems. You're not going to go from running on VMware in a physical data center to running on Kubernetes in the cloud in a month. That's just not the way that you do things, and it's not a good idea, right? What's that? No, it didn't lie. Okay, so I'm sorry. It might work if you go to Azure, but I wouldn't go to any other cloud service. I'm just kidding, Bridget.
It's a hype thing, right?
Yeah, it totally is. Well, and it's super, it's when you don't have production services running on your stack, standing up Kubernetes, thinking about trying to run an Istio service mesh and doing all sorts of really interesting things with hello world containers is really exciting, and it is really promising, and there is actually a ton of promise in the technology, but not for the things that are running in production in your system right now that are making you money and are working just fine. You got to find a balance on those things. But you have to future-proof them, right? Where your production is running right now is not going to be where it's running 3 years from now. So make those changes on your time. Don't make them on the time of whenever your infrastructure or those incidents decide to cause you problems. And that's the advice here is you got to figure out a way to make sure that that is something that that infrastructure is going to cause you problems someday. So take care of it on your time, not theirs. There's obviously no more pets out there. The ROI is there to take care of that. Just start thinking about it. Start the conversations. You won't start the project tomorrow, but start the conversations. And then the last space, monitoring and observability. So at SPS, this is the area I'm probably most passionate about. Primarily, this space is owned by SRE, but our CloudOps orgs involved in some of this as well. Our customers here are the product teams as well as some of our operations teams. But I think that there's a lot of metrics in this space that tell you how well you're doing. If you're highly available, if you don't have a lot of alert fatigue, you've got good accuracy with your alerts. Your total effort to implement, if you're going to build a new service, is low. Your learning curve to use these tools, if you're new, is low. When we did some customer review and feedback, we got some feedback that it'd be nice if there was less manual configuration. And so within our SRE group, we built some work around how could we potentially automate some of the way that we use. One of the tools we use is Logic Monitor, as well as PagerDuty. So if somebody's going to deploy a new service, can we create that service in PagerDuty automatically, wire up the alert config and things like that. So we've got some work going on there. It's going pretty well, and it should save our customers some time. And that's something that's going to save every delivery team time if they're building a new service. Other ways that this might apply to your situations. So build tooling that can be globally shared. Prometheus is getting a ton of traction here. It's really hard to ignore that. But there's a lot of tools out there, and the Astana guy is just wishing that I would bring that up one more time since he sponsored and bought us beer. So this is an area that is really interesting. One of the things I would say about SPS when we went through a journey of getting more consistent with our monitoring tools is that I watched this progress to just speaking the same language. When you're sharing the same monitoring tools, you're sharing graphs. I am terrible at network-related problems, but I can look at a graph that is drop packets and see it go like that and know it's a bad thing and put it in chat and help with the conversation, or at least feel like I'm helping. I think they're probably more like, yes, Andy, that's interesting. Thank you for that data point. But the point is we're all speaking the same language. You don't have people on the command line doing something over on this server or somewhere else on a switch trying to get this data using a different tool. And that goes to great lengths in terms of your collaboration. Reviewing past incidents is super easy, and just consider what kinds of tooling would have made it better. Is there a common theme? And then just consider how to improve the use of existing tools. So maybe don't try to go advocate for new tooling, but what do you have today that's good enough that you're maybe not using as well as you should? Some caution here. Nobody wants to talk about getting more pages. So if you're trying to improve monitoring, maybe don't lead the conversation with like, hey, this thing broke and we could have paged you at 2 a.m., but we didn't have a monitor, so we didn't, and stuff. Really focus more on that customer experience and what it means to your business. And then advice here is just talk to your team members or customers and collect the feedback with a focus on reducing total alerts, right? Total incidents. The point here is that you don't want to wake people up, is that you want your infrastructure and your services to be highly available. And you can measure it in a way that you can drive improvement with that data. This, I would say, I think that this is the most approachable. If you're looking at all three of these and you're like, oh, man, all of these would be great to really drive on. I think this one's probably the easiest one to get started at, because you're just trying to say, hey, let's all get better together. I don't have to send you new alerts right now, but we could visualize this to start with so we can start talking about it differently. Lastly, I just wanted to throw some other tips and tricks out there really quick. When it comes down to it, continuous improvement is at the core of SRE. And it should be at the core of your motivations too. If you're not doing this because you're just trying to drive improvement in the org, if you're doing this because you want to deploy Prometheus, or if you're doing this because you want to run Kubernetes, please don't. Nobody's going to win. But figure out why. Certainly it should align, right? If you want to have more resilient infrastructure, figure out how to containerize your workloads and get it into Kube. But it should be at the heart of intent of trying to drive improvement within your org. And measure it or it didn't happen. You could do a really awesome project, get a bunch of stuff containerized, move it to the cloud, make it cheaper, make it more resilient. But if you didn't measure any of it, it didn't happen. Start measuring things now. Talk about what metrics you think you're going to change now. And set the bar and deliver high value for services by your team. So I think in operations, especially for folks in an operations space, it's easy to think about infrastructure and not think about it like a service. Hey, I'm provisioning VMs, or I'm just helping somebody use the cloud. But if you stop and think about what you're doing as a service, there's a lot of other ways that you can think about delivering infrastructure as a service that make it more measurable, but also let you set a tone with the org, right? You're now my customer. You're not a business partner. You're not somebody asking for more money because you want another server. You're somebody that's trying to do something important for our customers, and we want to help you do that. Communicate diversely and often. Don't find the one other person that's really excited about Kubernetes and then just talk with them every day at lunch and talk about how silly it is we're not doing Kube and do a side project with Kube. There's going to be folks that you have more friction with in those conversations, and there's going to be folks that agree with you. And find a balance. Force yourself to have difficult conversations along the way, and do that often. You'll find yourself repeating yourself quite often, and that's important because you might be talking to somebody who's so far from a monitoring problem that you're passionate about. They're not going to retain that conversation the first time you have it with them. You're going to have that conversation regularly with them, so be prepared for that. Create easy and approachable feedback loops. If you are in an environment where it's very ticket structured in terms of if you have an idea, send me a ticket and we'll get to it. People aren't going to send you a ticket. You don't really want their feedback. You might want their feedback, but they don't believe that. So stop and think about how you become more approachable as an org if you're trying to deliver a service. And then the last part is just be patient and be transparent. It's so important to be transparent. Share what you're working on. Collect feedback. Iterate on that stuff. And know that this is going to take time. Bridget spoiled my entire talk right away at the beginning by saying that this doesn't happen overnight. But she's right. So that's it for my other tips and tricks. Lastly, I just want to set this in your mind that the road to reliability, it doesn't actually have a destination. You don't punch in Google Maps and then get to a point where it says you have arrived. But it's a pretty enjoyable and it's a pretty darn rewarding road trip. And I highly suggest that for those of you interested, you figure out how to take it within your org because it's totally worth it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was so much hard-won knowledge. I especially like the part where you, on a bunch of those slides, you were like, and here's a caveat, and here's some horrible traps. It's
Yeah.
like, have you actually lived this?
We've been through a few. One, two.
A few things. So I'm sure that there are people who are going to have a few questions for you, and I know you're willing to entertain a few questions. But I'm going, since I have a mic in my hand right now, I'm going to ask the first question, which is, so if a person wanted to work in an organization like this, are you hiring for this stuff?
I personally currently have a manager for my SRE team open, and not to brag, but I am pretty convinced it is the best SRE team in the Twin Cities, and we're doing the coolest stuff. Also have a senior SRE on that position on that team as well. It's awesome. It's a great culture. Our product teams are working on some really cool stuff too. If you're looking to get in an environment that's not afraid to talk about hard things and tackle hard problems, this is a great place to be.
All right. I figure we just had to put that question out there because,
Thank you, Bridget.
But I bet people have questions about computers or something. So people can ask questions, or I'll just pick people and put a mic in their face. But
Don't pick
but
Andy.
John
Don't pick
here has an
Andy.
actual question.
Yeah, so one of your tips and tricks was continual improvement.
Yes.
Totally get that. It's really exciting. But earlier you talked about business priorities.
Uh-huh.
I could see a case where, well, you could keep improving and improving and improving, but is there business justification for continued improvement, or have you reached enough?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that challenge?
Yeah.
And some of the variables and dimensions of that?
I think that I don't know if somebody told you to ask that question. That's actually one of my something I'm most proud of here at SPS right now is that we've had the opportunity to build a role here that we call continuous improvement managers. But what we've done here is we've taken this idea that Susan Fowler delivered a great talk at Velocity about operational readiness that they did at Uber, where what they did is they defined what readiness meant for applications at Uber. So they stopped and they said, what are all the things that are important? And that ends up, if you stop and do that in your organization, that ends up being a giant list of undifferentiated engineering work. How often can you deploy? Who deploys? Who owns it? Where are you monitored? Do you have unit tests? Are you secure? What kind of security measures do you have? Do you have pen tests? All this stuff, right? And there's an interesting approach to that where you don't necessarily want to say everything should meet the top bar all the time. Brand new product, you don't know if anyone's going to buy it. Don't set the bar to be through the roof, right? But by organizing that data in a way that you can stop and look at it, it allows you to say, okay, where is the bar, or where are these services at? So now you can produce data that says, at least the way that we're trying to do it, we're not totally there yet, but there's really great promise in what we're calling confidence reports, where we say, hey, service XYZ, based on the number of GitHub contributors you have and the number of changes you make and your incident rates and your page rates and your total costs, we think that our confidence score in you is X. But we also break that down to things like our confidence score in security, or your agility, or your operations performance, things like that. So what gets really interesting over time is now you're talking about saying, well, okay, totally get it, organization, you have this feature over here that's super important for you to deliver, and I appreciate that too. I want us to grow as a business. But if we stop and look at the confidence reports, do we want to accept or acknowledge some risk here because the security score on these services that we're talking about developing features on, instead of maybe improving their availability scores or their security scores, they're not great, right? And like putting it in numbers and making it a business decision, because sometimes the right decision is to add that feature. It's not necessarily always to make it more stable, but sometimes the answer is to make it more stable. So as much as you can drive that business conversation to be data driven, it is a chicken. I think your point though is a good one. It is chicken and the egg. Like if you don't have the monitoring metrics, or if you don't have deployment rates or cost of deployment, like identifying how that's a business priority is harder.
So your key point is collect the data so you can have a data-driven conversation about this, which of
Yes.
those various dimensions
Can
you're
you-
after, or this
Yes.
feature versus these.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we're really fortunate at SPS in terms of
Sorry,
collecting.
can you repeat? Because you
Yes.
don't have the mic.
Yeah, so his point is where you can collect the data to have those conversations really sets you up effectively to have those conversations. And I think we're really fortunate right now at SPS where we have a lot of the monitoring tools and the infrastructure and a lot of the deployment automation centralized as services in a way where all the data is in the same place, right? If you have delivery teams in your organization and you have 28 different Jenkins servers and they're all completely different, and you don't have a change management process consistent across those orgs, measuring their deployment rates is going to be really hard.
Hi. Are there things that an SRE team will want to request from developers to make application more observable and
Yeah.
more monitorable? What
Yeah.
other type of things would you
These are fun
wish
questions.
development teams will implement
Yeah.
more often?
I really have a super strong opinion that if you build really important, valuable features into things like a platform that are valuable for developers to take advantage of, they're going to want to. So an interesting example of that, something like Prometheus. So we're working on building containerized platforms. We're working on building out our kube pattern. And if we build up infrastructure that will automatically discover their metrics endpoints on a container, boy, that seems like a silly thing for me to not do, right? So like having those services there in a way that are really valuable for our product delivery teams to take advantage of make a ton of sense. What's super hard to do, and I've done this 2 years ago and totally regret how much time I lost on it, was working with developers to say, we should do metrics better, right? So here's a stats.d endpoint, send me some data. And they're like, what data? Why? I don't get it. Request rates, why? I mean, it's in the logs. What do you want to do with it? Super hard, super difficult conversation to have because it didn't necessarily have a value proposition with it. So that's an example on the metric side. On the platform side, I think that there is an opportunity to build a contract. So the Google SRE book talks about this a bit too. If the SRE team could build contracts with the services that they run. So if you're like, hey, you know what? You have to be stateless on our platform if you're going to run containers. Put your state in a database or some other object store. Don't keep it here. Those types of, and we'll deliver you a platform that's 99.9% available. That's still a value proposition, right? I'm delivering you a containerized orchestration platform that's 99% available. That's a value proposition to somebody else. So I think it's really important when you're having those conversations for not to just be an ask, but a give-take.
Andy, how are your SREs related to the dev team and the org structure? So do you just have an SRE team and then there's a bunch of development teams and they're separate and they report separately? Or do you have development teams that have SREs as part of that ownership of that code?
This is a really great question. So what we've done at SPS is we have a central SRE team, and our focus right now, so going into 2019, our focus right now is to revisit and solve some of the problems we talked about here, doing a better blue-green deployment pattern, a few things like that. But we're focused on solving shared problems, and the way that we look at ourselves in the org is we're an enabler. If we build a service that makes every product team in the organization that much more effective, that's a huge X factor, right? And so we have some foundational things we really want to take care of early this year, and then our plan is towards the later half of this year, we're going to move towards an embedded model where what we'll probably do is we'll keep the org structure the way it is, but we'll pair our engineers with the different product teams, and we'll vary based on what the product teams have going on. We'll say, hey, you know what? We're willing to take on like 4 of your sprint points. So like, do you want us to help add observability to your systems? Do you want us to help simplify your deployment? Do you want us to add test automation to your deployment process? Things like that. So we'll be actually taking more direct sprint points within their sprints. I think that's going to be really valuable because now we're going to have a team of SREs that can come back together and share the problems that they're learning about within our org centrally. And if we're sitting down and talking about these and suddenly everybody's like, oh yeah, like we thought blue-green deployment was really easy, but this team, the way they're doing it and trying to use our systems is super hard. And then somebody else might say, yeah, us too. It's like, whoa, okay, we're building enough data points here where maybe we have better insight to a shared problem in the org that wasn't necessarily brought to us, but we just learned because we embedded. So.
Hey, so kind of building off of that question, because you're talking about embedded SREs, but what about just software engineers and working with like those guys directly? I mean, I've seen the SRE like embed model before. I'm sure I could go on my strong opinions, but won't. But I think part of it is like, what about the education kind of helping software engineers? Like, because you talk about the metrics behind this and like the tooling that the SREs are building, but I think there's like that little gap of like, sometimes an SRE will get on call and they'll teams like, everything's broken, and then we're like, well, you kind of contributed to that. Do you understand why and how you can work towards making things better? So like, what's something that SPS is doing? That bridge a bit more.
Yeah, so I think a couple things that we've got going on right now that I love is that our delivery team model today is if you built it, you own it, you run it. And so the response or triage process for anyone in the org is going to start in the service zone that they care about or that they're closest to. And so what I think that's done is that's created this really great environment of trust and accountability where if the SRE team is not offering necessarily the services that allow a delivery team to build something that can be as highly available as they'd like, they're coming to talk to us about that as a very specific business problem. I do think that there is a lot of opportunity for us to have better conversations the other direction too, and that's something that I think for those of you that are like part of a growth company, it's super easy to get it good enough and then keep growing, right? And so it's super hard to kind of stop and talk more about those things. It's like, I'll come back to kind of fix that deployment tweak later, or I'll come back and fix the fact that maybe the metric I'm using for scaling isn't quite the right one, but I think it'll be good enough. We're certainly not perfect in that. I mean, we're not perfect in anything, but that's an area I do think is making time for those conversations to happen when it's not 2 a.m. or when something's broken is something that we can do better. We have a few, we like internal guilds and things like that. So if people are really interested in platforms or containers or user experience, that kind of stuff, kind of birds of a feather can get together in those things, but it's not as structured necessarily. Did that answer your question mostly? You kind of broke up, so I did my best.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
it answers a bit of it. I mean, I think there's like, when you talked about like kind of the growth factor, because like there is that trap of you think you're communicating, and you'll sit down with some software engineers and they're like, yeah, we know, we understand, it's 4 a.m. and we broke it and it sucks.
Yeah.
But I think I guess kind of the more proactive part of this, which is how to like, when you're onboarding a new software engineer, being mindful of the tools that exist out there, but also being mindful of teaching that like best practice too, so that they kind of understand like, once I write, it goes out and deploys and all that, like what happens with that whole life cycle, and then the like, the conversation that comes after, which is kind of the repercussions of like not having that much awareness at times.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'd connect a little bit of that back to the confidence report things I was touching on earlier. It's a hard conversation to have, or like know how deep and what time to do it. But we try to use confidence reports for that. It doesn't cover everything yet, and I think we'll just keep getting it better as we have more of those chats.
Would you say sort of like, there's been a trend toward getting more security awareness within inside development teams? This seems like just another discipline that teams need to be more and more aware of, and then eventually some groups will create separate teams dedicated toward SREs like you are.
So
DevOps Handbook, for example, does talk about the evolution of SREs at Google. It seems to touch in this area of the conversation.
So John's just explaining that as the need grows, a lot of organizations are building out folks responsible for these areas. And I think that I would bring that back to kind of fundamentally one of the things I was trying to hit on was that these non-differentiated engineering efforts, I mean, it's different in every org, right? It's super circumstantial, your culture, your need, what your business model is and everything. But where you can, like that is a huge X factor for your organization. If you could centrally share non-differentiated engineering and do it really well, I mean, anytime, security is a great one too. Like everybody needs to be as secure as they can. But gosh, if you can like build automation in your deployment pipelines to make sure things are analyzed for vulnerabilities, or there's common pen testing that happens that's shared across the org, everybody's better as a result of that. So those things, when you're depending on your circumstances and what's approachable, centralizing those things with an intent to drive improvement is it makes a big difference.
I love that you highlighted the technical and human aspect of reliability, especially the trust and accountability.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how do you deal with cross-team dependency issues? Because like, for instance, for my team, in order for us to provide a reliable service for our customers, we also have like teams that we rely on, and if like if they don't provide us like a reliable service, that breaks the trust because it affects the way we also provide a reliable service to our customers. So how would you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's super important to respond to broken trust with a data-driven and intent transparent conversation. So if it's a scenario where you weren't able to meet customer expectations because somebody else in the organization didn't meet their expectations, firstly have empathy for the fact that they're well-intended, smart people, and something went wrong. or they were constrained by things in their org, right? And so entering it with that mindset allows you to have this conversation with them where they can be really focused on the fact that, like, listen, we didn't do right by our customers here. This doesn't have to be about my service performed, but yours didn't, right? The intent is we just want to drive improvement for our org and for our customers and win in terms of in our market space or against our competitors, right? So sometimes it's just leading with that tone and just articulating, hey, like, our customer commitments are 99.9%, and we're just not able to get there with the infrastructure we're running on. What can we do to help change that? Do you have new patterns we can migrate to? Do you not yet? But can we talk about how? How can we help you do that? And let's just be data-driven and recognize that the intent here is to drive improvement. It's not to be blameful in any way, and that takes time. If your culture is not ready for that conversation the first time you have it isn't going to go well. And I mentioned earlier in the talk too, like, there are scenarios where you just have to be super repetitive for a long period of time, and like, my engineers really hate it when I suggest this, but just go grab coffee with somebody that you have a lot of friction with. It doesn't have to be a formal meeting setting. It could be after the meeting or a week later, and just say, like, I think we're both trying to achieve the same goal here, and I get that there's friction here, but like, let's just recognize that we're both well-intended. That takes time. That conversation takes time. Got to be patient.
Cool, thanks. I think you might have just touched on a little bit of my question there, but you did talk about your tips and tricks about creating easy and reliable, perhaps, feedback loops.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe delve into that a little bit more on what does that actually look like? We all have different communication channels and structures, and that can be difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple big things, at least the way that I look at it in our org, is where it can be data-driven, and then sitting down and talking about the data. That's the best place to start, right? If you can be objective and say, like, hey, to your example, like, if we can be objective and say we're trying to meet 99.9% commitments, and there's 3 dependencies, which means any one of us could have a 45-minute outage and we're done for the year. Like, being able to sit down and kind of talk about that as a team and have that be objective is great. I think a lot of times situations don't allow for that. And so you kind of have to navigate the organization, and I would connect that to the point I made about just trying to be diverse in your communication plan and do it often. So you have to, like, naturally as humans, we're going to be drawn to more comfortable conversations, right? And so you're going to want to flock to the folks that want to talk about the same thing you do or share some of the same opinions, but challenge yourself to maybe identify other influencers in the org that think differently than you, or that have opposing views than you. And if nothing else, just try to build interpersonal relationships with them. It's not necessarily something where you can formalize, okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to have a subject matter expert from each delivery team come in once a month and give us feedback on how our deployment automation is. Those meetings are usually really poorly intended unless it's not good enough, which means you're getting feedback way too late because you didn't take care of the problems. And so I find just managing interpersonal relationships, trying to grab coffee with folks, or doing something along those lines and forcing yourself to do it with folks you're comfortable with and not comfortable with, tend to be more effective than trying to get groups of people together. And usually people are more honest in one-on-one settings. A lot more time consuming though.
All right, so I think I'm hearing that leadership is all about coffee.
I have a pretty big coffee budget, yeah.
Nice. Do we have one more question over here? Nate, did you say you had one there? Oh, okay. All right. We have one more here.
All right.
And then quick check to see if we have any more after this one, or do you get the honor of the last question?
Sure. Hi. Thanks. Great talk.
Thanks.
I guess I'm curious if you have any memorable experiences either on the road or that you're currently facing, like the conversations that are data driven as kind of like setting the terms for a more constructive, how do we solve this problem together? That's awesome. I feel like that data is going to be driven by those things which you can observe. What have been your biggest challenges recently or currently? What can't you observe? What are you struggling to observe?
How bad people want to use Kubernetes. Like, articulate a business case around that and figure it out. So, like, I actually think it's kind of funny, but that is a really great example. Like, there is no avoiding the industry movement or momentum behind that, right? It's a lot like cloud was 8 to 9 years ago. Everyone's rallying behind it. The CNCF is it's got great structure and organization to it. Everything feels really promising about that. which makes everyone really excited about it. But it gets people talking about things that isn't aligned to a business problem, right? Like, I want to run a service mesh. That's super complicated. Why? Like, you have 3 microservices. What are we doing here? You don't need. So. And
what problem does this solve?
Right. Yes. Thin mesh. Yeah, thin mesh. Yes. Much different than the thick mesh everybody else runs. Is that a thing? We should make that a thing. No, but so like I think those are the ones that I personally have had to get. I've had a lot of good experiences, and I'm really lucky. I really feel great about our culture. It is super healthy, and everyone has they're genuine and have good intent. But I think that is an area where like, and I get sucked into it. I get really excited about new tech myself, and so recognizing like, what's the ROI, what's the business justification, and does it align with our intent, and does it align with our business priorities? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here as an org? And it's hard sometimes to say, you know what? Like my team right now, like we really want to go build more resilient, more repetitive Kubernetes clusters, but right now we really need to get service discovery on the clusters we have and have a better proxy story. It's just the right thing for us to be working on right now, and that's hard to swallow for folks who really want to run Kubernetes. So, did that answer your question?
That is a valid answer.
Great. Okay.
All right. I think that we're probably to the part of the evening where everyone wants to individually come mob Andy and talk to him about their questions and problems.
If you come up, bring me a beer. Thanks.
Which beer are you drinking?
Pseudo Sue if there's any left, but Fleener probably got the last one.
I left one.
Oh.
There's one left.
Hey!
Hey! All right, you get your questions
you get the
answered
first question.
first. But can we give it up for Andy Domeyer?
Thanks.